Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into another fascinating historical figure. Today, we're tackling Alexander the Great. But we're going beyond all those epic battles he's known for.
That's right. We're taking a deep dive into the philosophies that really shaped who he was, how he thought.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Most people just think of him as this, well, this conqueror.
Yeah, a military genius for sure. But his life was also super intertwined with the world of philosophers and thinkers.
Okay, so let's start with the most obvious one. When we say Alexander the Great in philosophy, Aristotle's
Mhm.
got to be the first name that pops up. I mean, how big of a deal was that, really?
Oh, it was huge E. I mean, picture this, right? Young Alexander soaking it all up from Aristotle himself, like one of the greatest minds ever.
It wasn't just some basic princely education, was it?
No way. Aristotle was basically instilling this love for reason in him, critical thinking, and even how to, govern.
Wow, so even back then, he was basically being prepped to lead.
Totally. And get this, Alexander was so into all this learning that when he went on his military campaigns,
Took, like, textbooks with him.
well, not quite, but he did bring scientists and scholars along.
No way.
Oh, yeah. Conquering new lands and documenting discoveries at the same time. It shows him how much he valued knowledge, right alongside all that power.
It's like he was, what's that term? The philosopher king.
You got it. It was this ideal that Aristotle talked about, a ruler who uses wisdom and reason to lead.
But that makes you wonder, was Alexander really living that ideal out? Or was it just, I don't know, a way to make his ambition sound good?
That's a good question, and gets even more complicated when you think about how Alexander ended up going against some of Aristotle's core beliefs.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking about that. It's kind of a paradox, right?
Hey, big time. You see, Aristotle was all about Greek exceptionalism, the idea that Greeks were better than everyone else. But as Alexander's empire grew, he started adopting customs from the people he conquered,
Yeah.
especially the Persians.
I bet that didn't go over well with some of his Greek advisors.
Nope, they were hardcore stuck in that Aristotelian worldview.
So was this clash, like, a good thing or a bad thing for Alexander's leadership?
Tough to say for sure, but what we do know is Aristotle wasn't the only philosopher in the picture. Alexander met tons of thinkers, and they all challenged him in different ways.
Okay, so who else did he bump into?
Well, imagine this. Alexander, top of his game, right? And he meets this guy, Diogenes, a cynic philosopher who lived in a barrel and just totally rejected everything material.
Oh, wasn't that the sunlight
You
story?
know it. So the story goes, Alexander comes up to Diogenes, maybe looking for some wisdom, and asks him if he needs anything. And Diogenes, the ultimate cynic, just goes, yeah, stand out of my sunlight.
I mean, that's epic. A king being told to move by a guy who owns nothing. How did Alexander take that?
Believe it or not, he was impressed. He supposedly said, if I weren't Alexander, I'd be Diogenes, a conqueror envying a simple life, right?
Wild. It really
Yeah.
makes you think, right? Like, did all these encounters make Alexander question his own path, all that power and glory?
Totally possible. And we're just getting started. There's so much more to uncover, like Anaxarchus, who might have actually encouraged Alexander's belief that he was, kind of divine, or Callisthenes, who totally went against Alexander's growing power. Even those Indian philosophers who challenged Alexander's whole idea of ambition.
Wow, so we barely scratched the surface here. This is way more to Alexander than just the battles, huh?
Oh, yeah. And as we keep going, you'll see just how complex and multi-layered he really was.
Okay, so we were talking about Anaxarchus before the break, and how he kind of pushed Alexander towards this, like, belief in his own divinity. That's pretty intense. Where does that even come from?
Well, Anaxarchus, right? He was part of this whole school of thought that goes all the way back to Democritus, this guy who thought the universe was made up of atoms and that everything's always changing.
Atoms. So how does, like, atom theory connect to saying Alexander's a god?
So, get this. Democritus's ideas led to this emphasis on skepticism, right? Questioning everything. And Anaxarchus really ran with that. He thought the key to inner peace was not getting all hung up on stuff you couldn't control. Kind of makes sense when you think about how much luck was involved with Alexander's, conquests and all that. Like fate and fortune are playing a big role.
So Anaxarchus was saying, hey, Alexander, don't let it go to your head because it's just atoms bouncing around.
Maybe. He could have been trying to keep Alexander grounded, but at the same time, he also saw Alexander's crazy success as, proof he was semi-divine. You gotta remember, back then, kings and heroes were often seen as, connected to the gods.
It's kind of contradictory, though, right? Urging humility, but also feeding into this god complex. Was Anaxarchus playing both sides, do you think?
It's tough to know his true motives. But maybe he was trying to teach Alexander a bigger lesson, like stay chill even when everything's crazy.
Find your center amidst the chaos kind of thing.
Exactly. But not all of Alexander's philosopher buddies were so supportive, shall we say. We've got to talk about Callisthenes. This guy, he was a historian, actually related to Aristotle, who went with Alexander to write about all his, conquering.
Callisthenes, yeah.
Yeah.
He was the one who called Alexander out, right?
Bingo. In the beginning, he was totally on board, believed in spreading Greek culture and all that. But as Alexander got more powerful, he started, doing things the Persian way, like this thing called proskynesis, bowing before the king.
Oh, I thought that was, like, only for gods.
You got it. And to the Greeks, who were all about freedom and democracy, that was like crossing a line. Callisthenes, being a good Greek intellectual, saw this as, the start of tyranny.
What did he do? Try to talk Alexander out of it?
He did, and not quietly either. He publicly criticized Alexander. Can you imagine?
Oof, that couldn't have gone well. What happened?
Well, sadly, it didn't end well for Callisthenes. Soon after, there was this alleged plot against Alexander.
Oh, no.
Yep. And guess who got blamed? Despite being Aristotle's relative, he was accused of being part of it, imprisoned and executed.
That's awful. So was he really in on it? Or was Alexander just paranoid after being called out?
Who knows? Historians still argue about that one. But it definitely shows how much tension there was between Alexander's actions and those, core Greek philosophical ideals that guys like Callisthenes believed in. Alexander wasn't just a philosophy puppet, he had his own ambitions.
Right. Even people who learn from philosophers are still, people of their time. So what about when he got to India? Talk about a culture clash.
Oh, yeah. It was a whole other world. The Greeks called these Indian philosophers gymnosophists, which basically meant naked philosophers.
Like philosophers.
Yep. They were all about, intense self-discipline and wisdom, super different from anything Alexander had seen before.
What kind of discussions did they even have? Did they try to, convert him?
It doesn't seem like that. They had deep chats about, life, death, the universe, the meaning of everything. Really different from what he'd heard from Greek thinkers.
Give me an example.
Well, there's this story where Alexander sees this Indian philosopher just chilling while the whole army marches by. Super impressed. He goes up to him and asks, "What you doing?" And the philosopher goes, "Experiencing nothingness. What are you doing?"
Mic drop. He basically just called out Alexander's whole quest for, world domination.
Totally. And of course, Alexander, never one to back down, says, "I'm conquering the world." So the philosopher asks, "And after you've conquered the world, what then?"
That's the question, right? What's the point of it all? Did it change Alexander's thinking?
We can't know for sure, but it definitely made him think about the limits of ambition. These guys were all about inner peace, not material stuff. Very different from the folks who encouraged his divine status.
So he was getting all these conflicting messages, like a philosophical tug of war in his head.
For sure. And it wasn't just Greek versus Indian ideas. Remember Pyrrho? He went with Alexander to India too.
Pyrrho, the skepticism guy.
Yeah. It's thought that meeting those Indian philosophers, maybe early Buddhists or Jains, totally changed his thinking. They believed in the limits of what we can know, how reality is kind of an illusion.
So he started doubting everything.
Exactly. Imagine seeing all these different cultures, beliefs, practices. It must have blown his mind.
It's kind of ironic, right? Alexander trying to conquer everything and accidentally sparking this radical skepticism.
Totally. And we're just talking about a few of the philosophers Alexander encountered. Every meeting added another layer to his, intellectual and spiritual life. It's crazy.
So after all this philosophy, did it make him a better ruler? Or just give him fancy reasons for conquering?
That's the million-dollar question. It's clear he was into philosophy, but how much it shaped his actions is still up for debate.
It's like he wasn't just listening to all these ideas, right? He was really engaging with them, debating and trying to figure out how it all fit into what he was doing.
Absolutely. He wasn't just a conqueror. He was like a thinker, a seeker, wrestling with these huge questions about life and purpose and what it all means.
But, we can't forget that he was also pretty ruthless. Tons of destruction, you know. So how does that fit with all this philosophy?
Yeah.
Did it actually make him a better ruler? Or was it more like, I don't know, giving him reasons to justify all the conquering?
That's the big debate, right? But we got to remember, back then, conquest was just how things were done. It was the norm.
I guess so. And maybe for Alexander, spreading Greek culture seemed like a good thing, even if it, came at a huge cost. Do you think he really thought he was bringing enlightenment to everyone, or was that just A good story to tell himself.
It could have been both. Maybe ambition, but also a real desire to learn, to understand, to leave his mark. It's complicated.
This deep dive has been amazing. We've gotten to see like a whole other side of Alexander the Great, not just the general, but the guy thinking about these big philosophical questions.
That's what makes exploring history this way so cool, right? We're not just memorizing dates and battles. We're getting into the heads of these historical figures.
So what's the big takeaway here for everyone listening? What do we learn about Alexander and his philosophical journey?
I think the big thing is history is never black and white. People like Alexander, they were shaped by all these different ideas, beliefs, experiences. We have to keep digging deeper, asking questions to really understand them.
And maybe by understanding the past, we can even understand ourselves a little better. Huh?
Totally. And as you keep learning about Alexander, think about this. Knowing all the philosophers he met, all the ideas he encountered, what do you think drove him to conquer so much? Was it just plain ambition? A need to spread Greek culture? Maybe even a philosophical mission? Or was it something else entirely? Something to think about, you know? Keep exploring.
That's right. Lots to ponder. And until next time, happy exploring, everyone.